Tēnā koutou katoa, shalom and hello. I'm Deborah Hart. It's my honour to be your MC this afternoon. I want to acknowledge our survivors. Welcome to you. And welcome to their excellencies, members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of local, regional and central government, members of faith communities, Holocaust Centre of New Zealand staff and volunteers, friends, and a special welcome to our host this afternoon, Member of Parliament Ginny Andersen. Many thanks, Ginny. Thank you. This is a very important annual event and we're delighted to be here. Many of you were, of course, with us at the poignant ceremony at Makara Cemetery earlier this afternoon. As we do each year, we come together, we reflect and lay stones in memory of those lost in the Holocaust. The Mishnah says, whoever saves a single life saves an entire universe. The theme for this year's commemorations is the righteous among the nations. This honorific was created by the State of Israel to describe non-Jews who saved Jews from extermination. There are 26,973 people listed as righteous among the nations. Today, we give thanks to them. Each of those 26,973 people were upstanders, not bystanders. We often focus on the 6 million Jews and the others who were murdered in the Holocaust, quite rightly. But today we're going to give some of our focus to those who saved lives, putting their own lives in danger and often sacrificing their own lives to do simply what was right. A colleague recently asked me, how do you protect your career when you stand up for others? He told me it can have a chilling effect. He's right, I think it can. He was simply voicing what many feel, how exposed they feel when they're upstanders, that there is sometimes a price, a heavy price to be paid to be an upstander, often more than your career. And yet 26,973 beautiful people were upstanders at the time of the Holocaust, risking, as I say, more than their career. They showed strength, compassion and love, and as Elie Wiesel famously said, the opposite of love is not hate, it is indifference. Please welcome our host, Member of Parliament, Ginny Andersen.
Ko te mihi tuatahi ki te atua, nana nei ngā mea katoa, ko te mihi tuarua ki te whare e tū nei, tēnā koe. He mihi mahana kia koutou katoa, nō reira tēnā koutou, hui hui mai tātou katoa. Kia ora. Thank you. I'm really honoured to be here today to host you and to address the UN International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is in its 74th year in terms of the liberation of Auschwitz, the largest of Nazi Germany's concentration camps and killing centres. This day remembers all those killed in the Holocaust, that is over 6 million Jewish people, and up to 17 million people overall, including Polish, Slavs, Soviets, Roma, political opponents, homosexuals and disabled. The 6 million Jewish people killed in the Holocaust made up over 2/3 of the Jewish population in Europe at the time. I'm sure many of you are aware of that already. The word genocide itself was coined after the Holocaust when Raphael Lemkin lobbied the newly formed United Nations to adopt the Genocide Convention to stop such an affront to humanity ever happening again. The message from many, many atrocities and deaths was a simple one. It was never again. Yet in the decades it has happened, this message has not always been heeded. In spite of the lessons the Holocaust has given to the world, we have seen further genocides happen around the world. Cambodia, Rwanda, Darfur, Yugoslavia, and even Myanmar recently, to name a few. Due to its totality, its geographic scope, institutionalised, industrialised systemisation, the Holocaust is said by many to be unparalleled, but not completely removed from other genocides. We must remember the offence of the Holocaust, and we must continue to remember that message of never again. This year's message, the organisers have commemorated a special time to look around us at those we can see on the billboards around. We see in the hall the exhibition showing diplomats who put their lives at risk in order to save others. Even amongst the systematic targeting and killing of Jewish people at this time, in every country that was under control from fascism and Nazism, there were individuals who behaved bravely and compassionately, who risked their own lives to save others. These people are memorialised in Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Centre based in Jerusalem. They are known, as we have heard already, as the righteous among the nations. Altogether, there are over 27,000 of righteous among the nations listed. I've picked just one of those 27,000 to touch on today, a woman by the name of Eleanor Sipos, who settled in New Zealand after the war. In 1950, Mrs. Sipos moved to New Plymouth in New Zealand, and she lived there until her death in 1988. Mrs. Sipos was Czechoslovakian by birth, but she lived in Hungary, and she was a Roman Catholic. There are a number of instances in which she acted to rescue Jewish people during the war. In just one example, she helped a pregnant Jewish woman and the woman's 2 young daughters travel to Budapest when the train was stopped by German soldiers. The soldiers began examining the passengers. Mrs. Sipos went forward and asked the German soldier to help because the children had not slept well the night before. The girls were said to be dozing and still asleep and not to be disturbed. The soldier obliged. He carried one of the girls and led the group to the carriage where they would not be disturbed. Mrs. Sipos went on to keep the woman as her maid in her own home and arrange for the children to be sheltered in a nearby town. This is just one example of what Eleanor Sipos did to earn her place amongst the righteous among the nations. When in later years she was asked why, as a Roman Catholic, she risked her own safety to help a Jewish person, she said, "First, because I felt a great injustice was being done against the Jewish people who had no country of their own. They had nowhere to go. I had and have many good Jewish friends. Second, I am a Christian and a human being. All my life I have helped other people, individually and through movements such as the Red Cross, regardless of religion. One must always do what is best." There is a very simple message in those words. One must do what is best. The Holocaust happened more than 70 years ago and more than half a world away from where we stand today. It is of value to remind ourselves why we commemorate it here in New Zealand each year. First, the Holocaust serves as a universal reminder that we should never allow such horrors to happen again. Not anywhere and not to anyone. Never again. Second, the Holocaust came from conditions in those societies, from anti-Jewish sentiment and feeling that existed for centuries. In New Zealand here we have minorities, and it is fundamental to our identity and the treaty relationship which we based our first partnership, that we build the relationship with other cultures in New Zealand. It is a relationship based on partnership, consultation and mutual respect. And that is so important that we continue to build on that treaty relationship here in New Zealand. In Europe, we see again the rise of far-right groups and parties. In the US, we hear politicians advocating intolerant views of particular groups. We do not want these conditions to develop here in New Zealand. It is important that everyone understands the consequences of words, actions, and policies that discriminate against others. It is also important that everyone understands that they have a social and moral responsibility not to discriminate against others. And where we see discrimination, we have a moral and social responsibility to help others who are being discriminated against. It is these values and principles that motivated me to join the Labour Party when I was younger. We can learn from the righteous among nations and their actions that it is better to stand up than it is to stand by. Where there is discrimination, bullying, violence, where there is suffering, if we can help, we must help. Today, because of computers, iPads, smartphones, we have untold access to information right at our fingertips. But still, many have a lack of knowledge and a lack of understanding of our history, even recent political events. We all have gaps in our knowledge. I can tell you I've been on a pretty steep learning curve since being in this place. But mostly, there's no harm done from a bit of ignorance. A few things here or there. But some things are important, especially as the Holocaust falls further into the past and further into history. We need to be sure that we can remember the lesson it has left for all humans. The Holocaust Centre of New Zealand does fantastic work with the Human Rights Commission and other organisations to teach Kiwi youth about how discrimination, bullying and violence can lead to the racism that has underlied the conditions that led to the Holocaust. Today, especially on Holocaust Remembrance Day, we remember and learn from the Holocaust. We learn from those that suffered and died, and we learn from those around us who stood up against it. Recently, I visited a good friend, one who's well versed in the trials of history and the role that religion and ethnicity have played in the past. She's one of those good friends that you pick up where you started from, even though a couple of years might have passed. I told her that I was giving this speech today, and I shared that I was daunted by the weight of the topic that confronted me. And I told her and I asked her what I would do. And she looked at me and she said, "Isn't it simple, Ginny? Isn't it just a choice between light and dark?" And I think she was right, as always. Every day we need to remember and learn. Every day we need to be brave and compassionate. Every day we need to appreciate our differences, be they differences of religion, ethnicity, sexuality, ability, or political belief. We need to defend the right to be ourselves and the right of others to be different. And on a day-by-day basis, if given a choice, we choose light over dark. Thank you very much. He mihi mahana kia koutou.
Thank you, Ginny. I think many of us have heard stories about those people who stood up at the time of the Holocaust and saved lives, but it's always really very moving. So thank you for sharing the story of Mrs. Zebos. It was fantastic to hear that. You will probably all know that it takes a lot of organisations and people to organise a day like today. And UNESCO has long been a supporter of this event, and we're incredibly grateful for that support. The chair of the New Zealand Commission of UNESCO, Robyn Baker, is with us. Join me in welcoming Robyn to say a few words.
Ena mana, ena reo, e raurangatera mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Warm Pacific greetings to you all, and thank you to the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand for inviting me to speak today. I will begin my address by asking a question. How well do we know ourselves? It's been interesting today listening to the various stories that both at Macra and that Ginny has just told us. It centres in your heart about, well, what would we do? Imagine the scenario. You arrive home this evening and a stranger knocks on the door. Their eyes are full of fear and they beg you to hide them. They tell you that someone is after them and wants to kill them. Would you agree to hide them? I imagine most of us are thinking, yes, of course we would. However, think a little more. What if you know that helping this person could result in you going to die? Or even worse, that the penalty for you and your whole family for hiding them was death? Would you still say yes? The situation suddenly becomes more challenging, doesn't it? We like to think we would help, but the reality is that to help requires enormous courage, and we've certainly heard about some of that courage today. The topic of this year's Holocaust Remembrance Day is a very challenging one for nations, for communities, and for each one of us. It's so easy to say what we might do, so much harder to know how we might act if asked to step up, to be an upstander and not a bystander. As I thought about this topic, I reflected on two values that I've found to be so important in my professional life: the values of courage and generosity. These now seem critical to me to leading a meaningful life as well, one where we feel compelled to always act with courage and generosity. The history of the Holocaust reveals a range of behaviour that people are capable of when confronted with extreme brutality towards other fellow human beings. While the Nazis carried out their plans to murder millions of Jews and other supposedly inferior groups, many non-Jewish individuals and groups risked their own safety to protect and hide or evacuate people in danger. However, these upstanders were an exception rather than the rule. While we in no way condone the actions of the majority, I think we're all able to understand in some ways why they remain silent, why we would all like to think we would stand up for oppressed peoples. Failing to act is equally as human. During World War II, for every rescuer, there were countless others who were aware of what was happening. They could have actively helped out, yet they chose to stand by. At most, 5 to 10% of the Jews who survived the Holocaust in Europe did so because they were concealed and looked after by a non-Jew or a non-Jewish organisation. But again, as we've heard today, the Nazis succeeded in murdering 6 million of the estimated 9 million Jews who lived in Europe in 1939. It's extremely confronting to think about this. How could people let that happen? And what was different about the ones who helped? Clearly, it's not as black as white as we might first think. There are so many stories of people who took risks, large and small, on behalf of others. As others have reminded us today, we need to keep telling these stories so we might find better within ourselves the courage to be someone who helps and to act with caring towards others when the opportunity arises, even when it's so risky individually as well as to loved family members. Stories like the one of Johanna and Fritz Harkins, Dutch immigrants who moved to New Zealand in the 1960s. The Harkins were the first Kiwis to be honoured with a Medal of the Righteous Among Nations of the World award from Israel for risking their lives during the war by hiding a 2-year-old Jewish girl. For 2 years, they hid her in the attic and sometimes in a cupboard. She was passed on to another member of the resistance before her uncle could pick her up and reunite her with her mother and her sister in Switzerland. The Harkins were members of the Dutch resistance. Johanna sewed diamonds into the coats of Jewish children, and Fritz, who worked at the airport, sabotaged Nazi planes. Their son, Marcel Harkins, accepted the award posthumously on behalf of his parents, saying the award kept his parents' bravery alive and taught future generations that they too could make a difference. I recently came across a quote by a psychologist called Irvin Stube, who did a study of some of the wartime rescuers. I'm going to quote what he said. "Goodness, like evil, often starts in small steps. Heroes evolve, they aren't born." It's kind of a nice thing to think about. Heroes evolve, they aren't born. Very often, the rescuers made only a small commitment at the start to hide someone for a day or two. But once they had made that step, they began to see themselves differently as someone who helps. What starts as mere willingness becomes intense involvement. In other words, once people begin on the path of compassion towards their fellow human beings. They are compelled to continue on this path. Individual action is of course important, it's essential, but how much more powerful when the action is supported by others? That is why organisations and individuals who provide opportunities for people of all ages to develop the knowledge, skills, values and attitudes that can help prevent current day group-targeted violence are so important. The Holocaust Centre of New Zealand is of course one such organisation. The Human Rights Commission and its Give Nothing to Racism campaign is another excellent example. The campaign promoted a community-wide conversation, signalling that racism can begin in small ways and that each one of us can make a difference if we are attentive and prepared to take action. UNESCO is another important organisation that places its priority in building and sharing knowledge and seeking a more just and peaceful world through supporting individual and collective action. Education about the Holocaust and genocide is part of UNESCO's efforts to promote global citizenship education. In this context, UNESCO supports education stakeholders in their efforts to help learners become critical thinkers, responsible and active global citizens who value human dignity and respect for all, reject anti-Semitism, racism and other forms of prejudice that can lead to violence and genocide. UNESCO believes it's essential to learn about the history of the Holocaust in order to better understand the causes of society's descent into genocide and to raise awareness about the need to nurture peace and human rights to prevent further mass violence. This International Day of Remembrance is an opportunity to commemorate the victims and their legacy, as well as to alert people of all ages around the world about the dangers of racism and fanatic ideologies. By examining the stories and choices that were made during the Holocaust, we are not only able to better understand what happened, but we can reach a deeper understanding of the range of human behaviour in a time of crisis. By examining what happened, we can gain insights into the forces of our own lives that might encourage us to act cruelly or inhumanely, or to ignore such actions in others. At the same time, we can also ensure that we've established and sustained the conditions within our communities that support each one of us to learn and to build on our understandings and to be courageous in taking action. So each one of us is inspired and compelled to lean into taking a stance, to be courageous and generous. I'm just thinking of the comment Ginny just made about the whole thing about being individual, and then the MC before talking about how it can be a compromise to your career. Well, all of those things are true, and that is why having people you can hold hands with, who you know will stand beside you and with you, are also so important. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Each one of us has our own moral arc. We can help create justice in our own neighbourhoods and communities. Before long, the moral arc will spread through the world. Let us all recognise that we can make a difference to the world. We can use our individual and collective knowledge and energy to build a more just world. All it takes," and I'm going to punch your is making a choice. It takes courage, generosity, and the willingness to act. Thank you.
That, of course, was Trains of No Return by Ofra Haza. And thank you, Robyn, for your words. Paul Hunt was recently appointed Chief Human Rights Commissioner after he has filled many positions in the human rights area. He has worked in the UN in areas such as World Health. Most recently, he was a professor of law at the University of Essex. He's a Kiwi, and he's British, and he's back with us. He has a big task in New Zealand, and as I was listening to you, Ginny, I thought it might be the job description. Please welcome me and join me in welcoming Paul Hunt.
E te whanautanga mai o te tangata, ka hore ona here. E orite ana tōna tapu, tōna mana, me ona tika, ki te katoa. E nā mana, e nā reo, rau rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, katoa. Ko Paul Hunt, toku ingoa, ko au te amo kapua mo te kahui tika tangata ki Aotearoa. Today's International Holocaust Remembrance Day activities are my first public event as New Zealand Chief Human Rights Commissioner. And I'm delighted and I'm honoured. This is the way I'm beginning. And thank you so much for the opportunity to say a few short words. I want to acknowledge the Holocaust survivors, the fantastic work of the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand. May I acknowledge the members of the Diplomatic Corps, MPs, Wellington City Council, the Jewish community of Aotearoa, New Zealand, the tangata whenua and the manu whenua in this region, all friends and colleagues, all sponsors and organisers, shalom. I quoted at the beginning of my remarks from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 1, and it begins, "We are all born free and equal in dignity and rights." And our theme, as we know, is the righteous among the nations. And I want to deviate a bit from my prepared remarks because at the Makara Cemetery programme, Jill Day, the Deputy Mayor for this great city, made a reference to the righteous among the nations in Denmark during the Second World War. And this struck a chord. And I'm going to make a few remarks that I've never made in public before. And I make them with David's permission. I just checked with him. And he said, go for it. So I'd like to recognize today a relative, a great uncle from my wife's side of the family, Ove Bayer, a Danish architect who lived in Copenhagen during the Nazi occupation. He had Jewish ancestry and many Jewish friends. Now today, you will probably know, to get from Denmark to Sweden, there's a tunnel, and it comes out on an island, and then there's a bridge, a big bridge, across the water from eastern Denmark to western Sweden. But of course, in the 1940s, there was no tunnel, there was no bridge. You took a boat across. Well, like many Danes, great Uncle Ove had a little boat. Just before the Nazi occupation of Copenhagen, Ove took Jewish friends in his boat from Denmark to Sweden and to safety. My information is he did this shortly before the occupation. I cannot say he did this during the occupation. Maybe he did, but I can't know that. But even to do it on the eve of the Nazi occupation was not without risk. I know for sure that at least one other member of the family assisted the Danish resistance during the occupation. She's still alive today, here in New Zealand, but that's another story. Today, with you, may I recognize and honor great uncle Overbaya, and all women and men who are righteous among the nations, who all refused to be bystanders, and who all inspire me today. At the cemetery prior to this event, David expressed a sentiment that I really share. He expressed many, but I just focus on this one. He said he doesn't like to be pessimistic, neither do I. But, I'm sorry. Friends, we live in a dangerous world. In many countries, there's a pushback against human rights and tolerance. You know the countries. I don't need to name them. Regrettably, they are not few. And this pushback coincides with a time of shocking, visible, palpable, global inequalities. And it coincides with deep global poverty and a burning sense of injustice felt by millions of people. And I hesitate to say this, and perhaps I'm wrong, but one senses a fuse is being lit. Friends, I'm not saying this is the same as the 1920s and 30s. But with respect, I think we would be foolish if we did not recognize some resonances, some parallels, some similarities between those times and today. So it's imperative we resist this pushback against human rights and tolerance, which we are witnessing in some countries. We must resist what the books call the othering of people and the othering of communities. We must resist seeing others as alien, because we know from history that societies can slide from othering to demonization of the other. And history tells us that societies can slip from demonization to genocide. We know this well-known, disastrous trajectory from othering to demonization to genocide. So we must resist the global pushback against human rights and toleration. We must advance the human rights of all. We must insist on the human rights of all minorities. And crucially, we must find ways to reinvigorate human rights for these dangerous modern times. Here's a mighty global role for Aotearoa, New Zealand, and for all our peoples to stand up for all human rights, civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights for all, as set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was agreed in the shadow of the Holocaust. There's no time now, but I can't just resist mentioning, if you look closely at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it talks about duties too, duties of individuals to communities. But that's a talk for another time. I promise that as New Zealand Chief Human Rights Commissioner, I'll do all I can to bring human rights into the everyday realities of everyday lives, with a view to fortifying dignity, equality, flourishing, well-being, non-discrimination for all. As the great Irish poet W.B. Yeats put it, we must be strong. We must not, as he said, lack conviction. And I wish to end with W.B. Yeats. Some of you will know the magnificent prophetic poem he wrote in 1919, a prophetic poem just after the First World War and just as the Irish War of Independence was beginning against Britain. And I won't read out the whole poem, but there's one verse which I think has immense significance for today, not just in 1919 when he wrote his prophetic poem. The first verse reads like this: "Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned." And then crucially he writes, "The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." Friends, we must not lack conviction. No reira, he aha te mea nui o tenai au, maku e ki atu, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Mōri tangata, mōri ora.
Well, thank you, Paul, and you're going to need great strength for the role ahead, so we wish you kia kaha for the work that you have to do, which is so important. Many of us here will have stories of our family's survival and the people who helped. We've just heard in the last half hour about great Uncle Overbaya and the Harkins and Mrs. Zebos. For me, I'm grateful to the Lutheran Church for performing a mock conversion for my mother, Inga Wolf, and her mother and father in Prague, so that they had papers to say that they were Lutheran. I'm grateful to the Selincourt family, the English family, who welcomed and helped settle my mother, grandmother and grandfather when they sought refuge in the UK. Mary Mowbray is here to retell the story that she has of herself and her brother. She tells me that the rest of her family perished, but she and her brother were saved. Mary.
Tēnā koutou katoa, shalom, and good afternoon. In line with the theme of this year's Holocaust Remembrance Day, I've been asked to tell you how an exceptional non-Jewish woman saved me, my brother John, and many other Jewish people in Budapest. We were a professional, secular Jewish family, comfortable but quite aware of troubles ahead. My uncles and grandparents, looking for a safe refuge, got to New Zealand in 1939. Also, the family had turned Catholic before the war, hoping to avoid persecution. We had a nanny, Onus Hirchu, who came from a small country village and was part of our family. When I was 6, she was hospitalized with TB, but on her release, she kept in touch with us. The war reached us seriously in 1942, when my father was drafted into a Jewish forced labor unit, where he died within 4 months. My mother struggled on, running a musical kindergarten to supplement her widow's pension. In 1944, the regime became more extreme, and Nazi-influenced regulations came into force. We all had to wear a yellow star, had a curfew, and our house was designated with a Star of David. Relations moved in, one family to a room, to concentrate Jewish residents. Onus kept visiting and taking us children out, tearing off the yellow star. She tried to persuade the adults to go into hiding, and with her help, some did. In November 1944, in a final push by the Nazis, all women under 40 in our area were rounded up at dawn and deported, my mother included. We found out later that she was taken to Dachau, then Bergen-Belsen, and died shortly after its liberation. Our relations put John and me into a Red Cross home, where Onus found us, and within a short time took us to live with her and some Jewish friends she was hiding, using false names, false papers for us as her own children. The papers were not good enough to withstand scrutiny, and so we couldn't go down during the bombing to the underground air raid shelter. This was lucky for us when the back of the building near an ammunition dump was exploded one night. I still bear the scar. And it was those trapped in the shelter who were killed. We escaped from the burning house and walked to another house where Onus had a flat. She hid us through the rest of the siege and the bombing, scavenging for food in the rubble, even getting meat from a freshly killed horse. After the end of the war, she took us to her village, where her family fed us and cared for us. On our return to Budapest, we made contact with the relatives in New Zealand, and after great struggles with bureaucracy at either end, were able to set out and reach our grandparents via England and a long boat trip. After we left, Anush had a relapse of TB and died within 6 months. We mourn her as our second mother. We grew up happily in Wellington. I studied, married, and started a family. Then I became friends with Margaret Shields and worked with her on women's issues and politics. When she became Member of Parliament, she visited Yad Vashem. At her suggestion, when she came back, we started proceedings to proclaim Anush righteous among the nations for having saved us. We had to get testimony from the 2 friends we had lived with, as they were adults and John and I had been children. This was painful for them, but made us realise the extent of the rescue operation. While we were living with Anush and her 2 friends in hiding, we were only dimly aware of other people around us. In fact, Anush and her brothers were hiding many people from the authorities in a network of apartments they rented. We learnt that her brother worked in the Ministry of the Interior, which disbanded, allowing him to keep a case full of blank identity documents that could be used to save people. But while others helped, it was Anush who, with great resourcefulness and immense courage, was the strong-minded leader of the group. The Yad Vashem process succeeded, and a certificate and plaque were sent to her family village in 1992. Anush's name is also on the pillar commemorating the righteous in the courtyard of the Budapest synagogue. I keep in touch with the younger generations of the Hirchu family and made this collage to ensure that Anush's heroic deeds are remembered. And I'm going to put it here.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you for sharing that story of Anush, who was truly a remarkable woman. Thank you. And please do have a look at the document that Mary has provided to us. Perhaps we can find a way to replicate that as well so that it's more widely available. Jeremy Smith's wife, Alex, will agree with me that Jeremy is simply unable to say no to anyone wanting him to do something that will benefit others, particularly if those others are in the community and there's just a need. He and his entire family define present day what it is to be upstanders. Currently, he is chair of the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand, an organisation that is going from strength to strength and doing just incredible work to aid civil society. Please welcome Jeremy.
Thanks, Deb. Shalom, everybody. Firstly, some thank yous. Thank you for all attending this commemoration today, and it is so important. So many people are out to commemorate. A thank you to the Holocaust Centre Board who worked tirelessly to make things happen, to our volunteers who are there to keep the centre open, and now to our growing team of full-time paid people. And very pleased to announce that we've just appointed Chris Harris as the CEO of the organisation. Righteous among the nations. The question asked earlier about what would I do, and I think in every country there are situations where people do stand up, and I suppose growing up in South Africa I know a number of people who put their lives at risk to do the right thing. It was also today talked about education, and that's what we're about. We're about education, because you can't make informed decisions unless you actually understand the past. And as they say, if you don't know the past, you're going to keep on repeating the same mistakes. So as we speak, there is our fourth group of teachers are studying in Yad Vashem. 31 teachers are there for 3 weeks to learn more about the Holocaust, how to teach the Holocaust, how to continue with the message of gently in, gently out, so that children learn without being traumatized. But our key focus is on how do we change people as part of the education. It's all good and well learning the history, but how do you behave and how do you react differently? So with that, we've got a number of initiatives. First off, we started with the Anne Frank exhibition, travelling around New Zealand again, and our whole aim there is to have peer guides. So we teach the children, or the slightly older children, to take their classrooms through the exhibition, and that way it's a story being told by their peers, and again the message is, what can I learn from that? We're incredibly proud and grateful that we've managed to launch the Children's Holocaust Memorial in November, with the Mariah kids having collected the 1.5 million buttons, one for each child that died in the Holocaust. And with Matthias's incredible design and a great team around us, we've created both a memorial and an exhibition. And I invite you to go to the National Library to go and experience the emotion behind it, and also the education that goes with it. And our key, and it's so great to hear people talking about the upstander, and our entire message around the Children's Holocaust Memorial is about being upstanders. And it was aimed initially around school groups coming through and talking to them about what can you do to prevent bullying, what can you do to welcome foreigners, immigrants into your school, into your environment, and how do you actually stand out and be noticed. But as I went through and obviously been involved with the Children's Holocaust Memorial for some time now, and each button represents a child, each one is unique, each one is individual, and there are 1.5 million, and it's frightening when you go through there just how many buttons that is. And for me, it is more important to look at it and say, how can I just be a better me? How do I just make small changes in my life to be a better person? A better partner, a better businessman, a better colleague, just better in everything I do. It doesn't have to be big, momentous things of saving lives. It can be lots of little things, and lots of individuals who can make small changes in their lives that influence the people around them. So we do have a challenge, and I would like you to, or challenge you to be part of it, is we've got a hashtag upstander logo or buzzword, and I'd like every one of you to take your cell phone, have the little piece of paper with hashtag upstander, and do just a 30-second video of saying why you're an upstander, why you can make a difference, or how you make a difference. Post it on our website or post it on our Facebook page so we can get the individuals here who already are upstanders saying, this is why I'm an upstander, this is why I stand up for doing the right thing, this is why I will make New Zealand an example to other countries of how we can be a better place and a better society. Thank you.
And now we're going to hear from Chris Harris, who is the CEO of the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand. He's currently in Israel with those teachers at Yad Vashem, and we're going to hear a video message from him at Yad Vashem.
Shalom, my name is Chris Harris. I'm the CEO of the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand. It is my honour to be here at Yad Vashem's International School for Holocaust Studies with our 2019 Yad Vashem educators. We're here together to remember the victims and honour the righteous among the nations at the United Nations International Holocaust Remembrance Day 2019. It has been a rewarding experience for all of our educators. They've had the opportunity to walk along the avenue of the righteous and reflect on the role that ordinary citizens played in saving Jews. HCNZ's mission is to encourage our teachers to educate their students to learn from the righteous and to become upstanders in their community. We leave you with a quote from the Talmud: whoever saves a life saves the world.
We remember.
So you can imagine the great work they're going to do when they come back. Paul Seideman is a Holocaust survivor, and he's with us today. It's wonderful to have you here, Paul. He established a competition for Year 10 and Year 11 to 13 students at New Zealand secondary schools where the Holocaust is part of the curriculum. As a young boy in Czechoslovakia, Paul suffered enormously but managed to survive for several years in the Nazi German concentration and labour camps. After liberation, he immigrated to Australia and then to New Zealand, and he now lives here in Wellington, and I'd like to recognise him here today. It really is wonderful to have you here. And now please welcome Ginny Andersen back to the stage to give out the awards to those who won the competition. Come up, Ginny. The junior winner is Georgina Wong. Come on up. And the senior winner is Mark Seddon. And now we're going to hear those essays, those that won the competition. Georgina, please come to the stage and read us your winning entry.
It is easy for people who have not witnessed injustice to say they would do something if they were to witness it. However, these people are often unaware of factors such as an area's socio-economic state, and manipulation and propaganda which are used so that people will conform to the authorities' actions. This happened during the Holocaust, when millions stood by while Nazi Germany committed the injustice of punishing so many simply for being non-Aryan. Injustice is still happening today too, where fear is one of the biggest reasons why people do nothing. A place's socio-economic state can be a significant reason as to why injustice happens and why people stand by during it. This occurred in Germany after World War I, where a poor socio-economic state allowed for Adolf Hitler to come into power. Hitler went on to persecute and kill millions. including Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, and the disabled, as they did not conform to the Nazi ideal of a strong German. In the Treaty of Versailles, signed by Germany and the Allies after World War I, Germany was ordered to pay reparations to the Allies. The final amount owed was 37,000 million marks, a significant sum. The government owed so much money, including the reparations to the Allies, that it kept borrowing, principally from America, and printing money to pay for it, leading to hyperinflation in 1923. Consequently, millions of Germans lost their savings, and many, particularly the elderly, suffered poor health due to inflation-induced poverty. All reparation payments were suspended in 1932, but by then, much of the damage to Germany's people was already done due to the Great Depression. The Wall Street crash in America in 1929 meant that America needed to withdraw their loans and investments in countries like Germany. This led to businesses cutting production, reducing wages, and laying off workers. By 1932, over 6 million people were unemployed in Germany, and 18,000 farmers and 50,000 businesses had gone bankrupt. During this time, the Nazi Party, led by Hitler, campaigned, promising everyone a job, a house, and a Volkswagen, literally meaning a people's car. The percentage of the Nazi vote in the Reichstag in 1932 increased by 32% as a result of their campaigns. In 1932, they became the largest party in government, winning 37% of the vote in the Reichstag elections. On the 30th of January, 1933, President Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor. The economic depression faced by the Germans was a powerful factor that pushed them to vote for such a right-wing and extreme party. Throughout these campaigns, Hitler made his anti-Semitism views very clear, but there had also been anti-Semitic feelings across Europe for centuries. This was because many of the wealthiest were Jewish, and Christians did not like them as they believed Jews were the cause for Jesus' death. Even if people disagreed with their expressed views, the Nazi Party was still offering an opportunity for a better life, and so the anti-Semitic views were overlooked. People will also stand by during injustice because they have been manipulated, and this was a tactic used by the Nazis. In 1936 Germany, all youth organisations were banned and taken over by Nazi organisations, and membership to the Hitler Youth was made compulsory. Boys could join from the age of 6 and would stay until they were 18. Girls joined at 10 and did not leave until they were 21. In a further effort to have youth join, parents were not allowed a promotion at work unless their children were a part of Hitler Youth. Most youth wanted to join because of the exciting activities offered like games, sports and camping, which took them away from school and their home. However, as Marianne Gartner, who joined Hitler Youth in 1938 as a 12-year-old, recalls, it was not long before plain-faced leaders taught us marching drills and marching songs. There were now lectures on National Socialism, stories about Hitler, while extracts from Mein Kampf were used to expound the new racial doctrines. Children's lives quickly became indoctrinated with Nazi beliefs. There were Nazi school assignments and dictation exercises. One from a Munich primary school stated that Jesus saved people from sin and from hell. Hitler saves the German folk from ruin. By 1939, more than 8 million Germans were enrolled in Hitler Youth, and more than 90% of boys older than 14 were members. Hitler Youth placed emphasis on physical strength, and one of their aims was to make the youth loyal to Hitler. The youth began to reject the authority and values of their parents if it differed to what they had been taught in Hitler Youth, and they would persecute and exclude their Jewish peers. Overall, it meant that the youth obeyed the Nazis and idolised Hitler, meaning that when they heard of the Holocaust, some refused to believe it was true. Others had been so manipulated to support the Nazis that they believed everything the Nazis did was right and were unable to see the injustice of the Holocaust, and so did not try to prevent it. Other propaganda can be used to manipulate people to let injustice happen too. In Germany, before and during World War II, the Nazis predominantly used radio, films, and posters to convince people that their treatment of Jews was justified. The basic People's Receiver radio had only one station, and by 1937, 70% of households owned one, as well as there being communal loudspeakers. The radio was used to transmit Hitler's key speeches. In 1935, it is estimated that his speeches reached 56 million out of the 70 million people who lived in Germany. Hitler's speeches would be advertised beforehand, and all places would be ordered to put up loudspeakers so that everyone could participate fully in the broadcast. Hitler would often speak of the Jews, and on the 30th of January 1939, he spoke of his resolution to what he called the Jewish problem. The Reich Film Chamber regulated film content, banning several American films while also producing their own. In 1936, a two-part film of the 1936 Olympic Games was released. The film was meant to symbolize the new Germany and its Aryan ideals. In 1940, 3 anti-Jewish films were released. Der ewige Jude, the Eternal Jew, portrayed them as a parasitic race, and Yud Sus told the story of an 18th century Jew in Württemberg who was hung following the expulsion of Jews. Admission was only allowed at the beginning of the movie, and newsreels conveying key Nazi ideas were shown before each film. Posters were effectively used too. A poster for the film The Eternal Jew depicts a Jew holding the country of Germany underneath his arm. The Nazis were showing that as long as there are Jews, they will always be holding Germany back. There were people who resisted Hitler and the Nazi Party, but they were in the minority. Those who objected very strongly to the Nazi Party's policies were often the ones who would be brave enough to publicly voice their opinions. An example is a group of communist Elas partisans who captured 81 German soldiers near Kalavrata, Greece, on October 17, 1943. Most soldiers were shot by the partisans. However, 2 survived and raised the alarm the next day. In response, Germany deployed over 3,000 troops, and on December 13, 1943, at least 463 males aged 15 and over were massacred. It was very common for Germany to react like this. Germany's Gestapo, the secret police, arrested, tortured and murdered those who spoke out against the Nazis and those who helped hide Jews, as well as their families. It was these acts of terror which invoked fear in those who felt that the Nazis were doing wrong, meaning that they remained silent. People did not want to see others, including innocent civilians, being punished for their own actions. Over 70 years later, injustice is still occurring, and one of the biggest factors for letting injustice happen is fear. In Russia, many do not object to the current Russian President Vladimir Putin's way of ruling because of fear. When Putin was elected, he brought order and stability to a country which had been under chaos. Lyubov, a pensioner in Russia, says that their pension isn't much, but it's enough because things are stable. It is the fear of the unknown which stops many from not supporting Putin. Lyubov told BBC's Sarah Rainsford, "Putin, only Putin, he's our man. If someone new came, we'd have to start all over again, and who knows how that would work out." In other places, it is the fear of what the authority would do to you if you disobeyed, which prevents people from speaking against injustice. Extremist groups in the Middle East are quick to turn to violence for punishment for disobeying. The Taliban, an extremist group mainly in Afghanistan, do not want girls over the age of 10 attending school. When Malala Yousafzai spoke out about this, they shot her in the head. The knowledge that groups like the Taliban can and will commit such acts is more than enough to convince others to back down. They do not want themselves or their family and friends to be hurt or killed in such a brutal way. When people stand by during times of injustice, it is because their ability to see the humanity in others has been overwhelmed by outside factors, such as the socio-economic state they are in, manipulation, ignorance, propaganda, and fear. Those that do try to do something or prevent injustice look past the outside factors and see humanity in the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgina. That was really fantastic. And now we're going to hear from Mark Seddon, the senior winner of the Essay Prize.
Diplomats, ministers, members of the Jewish community, interfaith members, distinguished guests, and very importantly, Holocaust survivors and descendants. It brings me great pride to be here as a speaker today. I hope that my message of optimism and a just future will resonate strongly with everyone. It is my belief that we can live in a future free from injustice, a world in which we no longer find ourselves bystanders, instead taking an active stand to put an end to injustice altogether. Before this, though, we must understand the reasons why many stand by in the face of injustice and the associated dangers of doing so, and also the reasons to stand up to injustice and the importance of doing so. In the words of Edmund Burke, evil triumphs when good people do nothing. Too often, people don't know enough or don't care enough to do something. As individuals, we tend to insulate ourselves from problems, seemingly justified as the problem is not ours. The alienation of Jewish people as the other, together with the strong German ethnic identity, paved the foundations for many to dismiss the rampant injustice, as racial prejudice was a concept accepted rather than challenged as we see today. Furthermore, the deceptive portrayal of the deportations as a resettlement of Jewish people was passively accepted by many Germans. Such restrictive practices of the Nazi Party meant that many Germans either did not know enough to stand up or did not care enough to stand up to the injustice of the Holocaust. Fortunately, many people do care enough to intervene to eliminate injustice. German industrialist Oskar Schindler is credited with saving the lives of 1,200 Jews, employing them in his factories, and furthermore providing Nazis with bribes and gifts, selflessly spending his entire fortune to keep these people safe. Benjamin Franklin famously stated that justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. Schindler, together with many other valiant upstanders, embody this notion, for their decisions ensured that justice would not be enacted upon those they saved. Conversely, in times of injustice, many people are reluctant to intervene out of fear. Under the totalitarian rule of the Nazi Party, the course of justice was perverted, and injustice thrived under the abuse of absolute power. Generational and village-wide massacres acted as strong deterrents in intimidating the general public to idly stand by in the face of injustice, exemplified by the introduction of the death penalty to Poles helping Jewish people. In spite of these threats of severe repercussions, many individuals, groups, and even whole communities defied the injustice of the Holocaust. For example, the execution of the Ulmer family of Markowa in Poland for concealing 8 Jews by no means deterred other families in Poland from hiding Jews, even in Markowa, where at least 17 survived the war. Such acts exemplify mankind's capacity for morality, showing that standing up to injustice is worth the punishment, as living with injustice, knowing that you could have done something to stop it, is a punishment in itself. Another reason as to why many may stand by in the face of injustice is because of societal conformity. The tendency of mankind to conform is to the detriment of justice, as it fosters behavior in line with the thought of, if others aren't helping, why should I? In a modern sense, societal conformity makes us somewhat uncomfortable standing up to injustice. We desire to fit in, to be popular, to be cool, and these desires often take precedence over any injustices in our way of achieving them. Conformity with Nazism and its horrific ideological beliefs ensured that injustice went seemingly without opposition during the Holocaust. Nazi propaganda on racial purity and anti-Semitism convinced many of Jewish racial inferiority and made them believe that offenses against them were not unjust. There were, however, many courageous opponents to Hitler, challenging the ideology and practices of the Nazi Party. A notable example of this being German soldier Karl Plage, who refused to conform to Nazism after witnessing the genocide of Jews in Lithuania, described by Plage as unbelievable things that he could not support. Plage used his senior position in the German army to employ and protect Jewish people and is attributed with saving the lives of 1,240 Jewish people. From this, we see that people intervene to prevent injustice when their own sense of humanity is challenged, with Plage and likewise Schindler epitomizing this notion. Injustice is a disease, one that is highly contagious, but fortunately one that is curable. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." We must recognize the urgency to eradicate injustice, to prevent it spreading. The White Rose, a resistance group formed in Munich, created unrest within the Nazi Party and incited greater German opposition to the Nazi regime through their distribution of anti-Nazi leaflets. This evidently reflects what I believe to be mankind's innate desire to prevent the spread of injustice. Albert Einstein said, "The world is a dangerous place, not because of those who do evil, but because of those who look on and do nothing." Standing up to injustice means doing the right thing, even when the right thing is the hard thing. We can have injustice, or we can have justice. The choice is ours. Injustice or justice. I choose justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Well, that's the end of the formalities for this afternoon. The Embassy of Israel has made it possible for us to have the exhibition Beyond Duty, which is all around us here. The exhibition is dedicated to the righteous diplomats who saved Jews, usually by way of their positions as a diplomat. I understand it's displayed at the UN headquarters in New York for UN International Holocaust Remembrance Day. So please do take some time to have a look at the exhibition. It's really fascinating, actually. I want to thank you all for coming. I'm going home to do a video with the hashtag Upstander. So I hope you're all going to do that too and load it on the Holocaust Centre's website via their Facebook page. I want to thank in particular our host, Ginny Andersen. Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming. Go well, everybody.